Hi everybody, Chodesh Tov, and I hope the month should be a good month, the month of Tu B'Shvat, the month of fertility, the beginning of spring, as it were. And B'Ezras Hashem, it should also be a nitzutz of Geulah. The Parshios, of course, we're reading the Parshios of Yetzias Mitzrayim, and the Makos are divided in a fairly asymmetrical pattern. 7 of the Makos occurred in last week's Parsha, and the last 3 that finally break Paro, that's the Arba, the locust, the Choshech, the darkness, and the plague of the firstborn, they occur in Parshas Bo. And the Sfarim like to say there's even a little remiss to that, because the word Bo el Paro, go to Paro, the gematria of Bo is Beis Aleph 3, as if to say there are 3 more Makos that come. Now obviously, Hashem did not need 10 Makos to take the Jews out of Mitzrayim. He could have done it right away without any Makos at all. Moreover, the very fact that Hashem hardens Paro's heart in the last 5 indicates that the purpose of the Makos is not to force the Jews, force Paro to release the Jews. Then it would make no sense that Hashem is making Paro impervious to the pressure, but rather the Makos are designed to demonstrate Hashem's mastery over the universe and over human beings, as if to make a mockery of Paro and to basically say you are nothing more than a puppet at the end of a string, and don't think that you have the power to do anything at all. Again, in some ways, I don't want to be too overtly political, but again, I think I've mentioned a few times the idea of someone like Donald Trump being president of the United States and yet doing so many good things for Israel really is a demonstration of that God is really in control of this process, because from a human perspective, the process makes no sense at all. As I say, even President Trump did not believe for a moment that he was going to win the election, and he wasn't in it for that. He was in it to improve his brand and make money from the defeat, and then he got hit with quite a big surprise, as all of us did. And yet we see how Hashem uses it for his purposes. And that's really what the Makos themselves demonstrate. Now, the Haftorah of last week and the Haftorah of this week essentially deal with the same theme, except for the fact that last week's Haftorah is from Yecheskel, and this week's Haftorah is from Yirmiyahu. And of course, you'll remember that Yecheskel and Yirmiyahu are contemporaries. They lived during the same Tekufah, and this is the Tekufah immediately preceding and immediately subsequent to the Chorban Bayis Rishon. The difference is Yirmiyahu is the Navi who lived in Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Chorban Beit HaMikdash itself. Yecheskel was exiled to Bavel 11 years earlier. Remember, in the book of Malachim we read that 11 years before the Chorban there was an exile of what is called the Charash and the Masker, which literally means the carpenters and the locksmiths, those people that were capable of making weapons. But Chazal understand that to mean the Talmidei Chachamim, the great Torah scholars. Mordechai, for example, was exiled to Bavel 11 years early. That's called the Golus of King Yehoiachin. That's why it says in Megillas Esther, Asher Heglam Yerushalayim, that Mordechai was exiled from Yerushalayim, Im HaGolah Asher HaGlasa, Im Yechanyah Melech Yehuda. Mordechai was not exile, Yecheskel was not exile. Now, both Yirmiyahu and Yecheskel have a prophecy that the great, powerful Egyptian empire of their time is going to fall and be defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. And Yecheskel talks about it, and Yirmiyahu talks about it. The downfall, the breaking of the great, powerful Egyptian empire. Now, in some ways, the connection to the Parsha is very obvious, right? The Parshios of the 10 Makos, and particularly this Parsha, Parshas Bo, talks about the final breaking of the power of Egypt, and that's going to happen again, because the Egyptian empire eventually became very powerful, and in fact, the Jewish people turned to it at times when they wanted to get rid of Babylonia. They went, to the other direction, etc. And God is saying that Mitzrayim is like a broken reed. You lean on it for support, and all it does is give you splinters in your arm. And that is, all of the reliance on Mitzrayim turned out to be false and worthless. Now, one chronological point, because I do want to move into the Parsha, one chronological point that is interesting here is that the Nevi'im give us, after the Nevuah of the fall of Mitzrayim, the narrative then goes on and actually describes Nebuchadnezzar conquering Egypt. Because these were the two rivals for world empire at that time in the world. And it mentions that this occurred in the 27th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The 27th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And it's important to know that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So what that means to say is the destruction of Mitzrayim in year 27 was not much of a comfort to the Jewish people because the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed 8 years earlier. They're in the middle of the Galut. Right? This is before Cyrus, before any redemption. There was no redemption on the horizon. And yet, the Navi says, the day that Egypt falls, Atzmiach Keren, right? That's the phrase we have in davening, Matzmiach Keren, God causes the growth, the sprouting of the horn of salvation. That somehow the fall of Egypt is linked to the redemption of the Jewish people. And it's a very, very strange correlation, because it is true that at the time of the Exodus, the fall of Egypt was linked with the redemption of the Jewish people. But the fall of Egypt in the hands of Nebuchadnezzar seems to have no particular redemptive aspect to us. We're dwelling in our Galut. So the Meforshim in both Yecheskel and Yirmiyahu have a lot of difficulty trying to make sense of in what way is the fall of Egypt redemptive. Rashi offers an interesting explanation, because the Pasuk goes on and says, after Egypt falls, the land shall be desolate for 40 years. And then the Egyptians shall return, but they will be a mamlacha shefala, they will be a low and insignificant country. So Rashi wants to suggest the following. When it mentions there's a Keren Yeshua, it is not referring to the year 27 when Mitzrayim falls. It refers to 40 years later. And Rashi makes a whole cheshbon that was towards the end of the reign of Belshazzar. So here you have to know a little bit of the book of Daniel. That is, Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 45 years. He was succeeded by his son, Avil Merudach, who reigned for 23 years. And then his grandson, Belshazzar, became king. Belshazzar, by the way, was the father of Vashti, of Purim fame, or Purim infamy. And Belshazzar, in the 3rd year of his reign, wanted to celebrate the vanquishing of the Jewish people and the final destruction of the temple, because he had calculated 70 years had already passed since the Churban, and there was no redemption. So he figured God had forsaken the Jewish people. So what did Belshazzar do? He took out all of the utensils of the Beis HaMikdash, and he made a great party, a great celebration. And what happened at that great celebration? One of the most dramatic scenes in Tanakh, a phrase that has entered the English language, the handwriting on the wall. A big hand comes and inscribes words on the wall that nobody can read. And Daniel is able to decipher them because they are in the Hebrew script, the Ketav HaShurit, the script that's in the Torah script. And it says in Aramaic, not in Hebrew, Menei, Menei, Tekal Uparsin. Menei, Menei, your deeds have been counted and recounted. Tekal, they have been weighed and found wanting. Ufarsin. Parsin is a bit of a pun. Parsin can mean, and the Persia will take over. Or Parsin means your empire shall be broken. So it's both meanings are correct. And that night, indeed, what happened was, in a virtual bloodless coup, except for Belshazzar himself, Belshazzar was killed by his own servants, and Darius I of Madai, Persia, Paras Madai, took over. So what Rashi says is the following. Rashi says, there's a lot of background you need to know. Rashi says, the reference that the downfall of Mitzrayim shall be a tzmichat keren does not refer to the downfall. It refers to the 40 years after the downfall. And that is around the time when Belshazzar died. Because remember that when the Babylonian Empire fell to the Persian Empire, that is the beginning of Yeshua, because it was Cyrus, Koresh, the king of Persia, who allowed the Jews to go back and build the Beit HaMikdash, although it was not built for a number of years afterwards. So that's how Rashi understands the Matzmiach Keren Yeshua, the idea of, because it corresponds to the fall of Belshazzar and the anointing of Cyrus, of Koresh. See, Darius only ruled for 1 year, but Darius Harishon was only very, very short, and then Koresh was right afterwards, and Koresh made that great proclamation. You know that when Harry Truman recognized the State of Israel in 1948, and it's come to light that Truman had some of the anti-Semitism that was typical of the time, but I don't really consider it anti-Semite. His closest friend was a Jewish guy. His business partner, Eddie Jacobson, was a Jewish guy. But Truman was told by a lot of rabbis that you are the Cyrus of our generation, because you are the non-Jewish emissary of God that has been chosen to invite the Jews to come back to the land. I'm not sure why that was more than maybe Lord Balfour, but whatever it was. So Truman, who was a student of the Bible, very much enjoyed being Cyrus. So for the rest of his life, whenever he was honored at a Jewish banquet, which he often was, so when they would talk about his role in recognizing the State of Israel, if they didn't mention Cyrus, he would pull at the jacket of the MC and say, "You forgot Cyrus, Koresh, and the like." Okay. So that's what Rashi learns. But the alternative to learning is this. The alternative to learning it is that redemptive experiences take time. In other words, what God is teaching us is something about how we view the messianic process in our own time. And that is, on one hand, the fall of Mitzrayim seemed to have no benefit to the Jewish people whatsoever. This was after the Churban Beis HaMikdash. We're in the middle of Galus. So I happen to read Mitzrayim fell. Well, maybe I get some schadenfreude, I get some pleasure out of that. But nevertheless, that has no impact on my situation. But the Navi, by linking the fall of Mitzrayim to a Geula that didn't take place until many, many years later, is telling us that many actions and many events in the world which seem to have no causal link to ultimate redemption are really part of a much longer process. Let's consider, for example, the whole issue of Zionism. One of the controversial issues, even certainly in the Haredi world, but even in the Dati Leumi world, is whether we regard Hakamat HaMedina as Aschalta de Geula, right? A Dati Leumi would certainly regard, most of us certainly regard the State of Israel in very positive ways. We're very grateful for it. We celebrate Yom HaTzmaut in one way or the other. But Aschalta de Geula is a loaded term. Aschalta de Geula is a term that says this is part of the messianic process. And that even has political repercussions, because if you look at it as Aschalta de Geula, you can't really consider territorial concessions or land for peace or any of those deals, because you're contradicting a messianic process, as opposed to a pragmatic view, which could look at it, it doesn't work anyway, but you could at least look at it in theory as part of a political bargaining process. Once you bring out the Aschalta de Geula card, you cannot deal with that at all. You just have to say, this is it, and we're not going to give up a single inch for anything. Now, in the Tefillah L'Shlom HaMedina, the word Aschalta de Geula is not used, because that's an Aramaic term, but it uses a term that's roughly equivalent, and that is Reishit Tzmichat Geulatenu. It is the beginning of the flowering of our redemption. Now, do you know, I don't know how it is in Eretz Yisrael, but in Chutz La'aretz, there are Batei Kinesiot that say the prayer L'Shlom HaMedina, but they do not say the three words, Reishit Tzmichat Geulatenu. So they certainly support the State of Israel and they pray for its welfare, but they don't want to take a position on is it part of the redemptive process or not. Now, part of the arguments are, well, listen, I thought the redemptive process is supposed to, usher in peace and tranquility. And the founding of the state resulted in wars, and the wars continue to this day, either open wars or terrorist or surreptitious wars and the like. How could that be part of the Geula? And other arguments are, how can it be part of the Geula since so many of the Zionist leaders were not only non-religious, but to some degree even anti-religious, and the old famous arguments that how come in the Declaration of Independence of the state they use a phrase Sur Yisrael instead of directly using God, when the U.S. Declaration of Independence basically says endowed by our Creator. So people make that argument. But Rav Kook, well, of course Rav Kook was not talking about the state of Israel, but Rav Kook he died before there was a state, but Rav Kook was talking about the return of Jews to the land and the building of the land by the hands of people who were not necessarily faithful to Torah. He basically said that the redemptive process can involve all sorts of different types of people, because that is part of how we bring them back, meaning some people come to the land because of their connection to God, and some will come to God because of their connection to the land. So even if somebody comes to Eretz Yisrael and in their conscious mind it's because of socialism, communism, Zionism, whatever it is, and they want nothing to do with God, that's what they think. In reality, their neshama wants to be connected to the holiness of the land. And their mind will come up with conscious rationalizations why that is so. And therefore, Rav Kook considered anyone that was involved in Binyan Haaretz on any level, Rav Kook considered that to be holy, sacred work, even if the very person who was doing that work did not define himself or herself, in that category. Now, as everyone knows, Rav Kook was and still is roundly criticized, although I saw a heard a very cute story. We lost a great gadol of Aaron Leib Steinman the other week, and Rav Steinman, of course, came from Rav Steinman came from a very different world than Rav Kook, and a very, very different hashkafos in some ways. But the common denominator between them was a great, great love of Jews and a great desire to minimize the hatred and the polarization and the sinas chinam. So Rav Steinman, as a result, had some enemies within the very religious world. They didn't like the fact that he was too tolerant of people who were not so righteous. So there was a graffiti in Mea Shearim that said, Steinman equals Cook, as if to say that was the ultimate, that was the worst thing you could say about somebody. Steinman equals Cook. So they say Rabbi Yashiv, this was around 10 years ago, Rabbi Yashiv, who was still alive, walked by, and Rabbi Yashiv didn't pay attention to wall signs. He got attacked himself sometimes. And Rabbi Yashiv shook his head and he says, Rav Steinman is a great man, but he's not as great as Rav Kook. So Rabbi Yashiv thought it was a compliment. He thought it was an excessively great compliment. And in fact, it was intended as a great sign of bizayon. Now, the reason why I am digressing here is I just want to point out, therefore, that Rav Kook says the process of geula is not necessarily an instantaneous, miraculous, smooth process. It involves many different types of people, some of which really don't even share a commitment to Torah, at least on one level. And it involves, there'll be wars and setbacks and defeats. And you make one step forward, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and sometimes 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But that's not a contradiction to redemption. And thus, that's why the Navi is highlighting the downfall of Egypt that seemed to have nothing to do with your redemption is in fact Hashem's first message to you that your redemption will be coming. And it didn't come for many, many years, but that was part of it. So there is really an eternal message in the idea that the downfall of Mitzrayim occurred in the middle, not even in the middle, towards the beginning of our dark golus of 70 years. So it was an event that seemingly gave no particular hope to Am Yisrael. And yet the Navi says, that's the first event of your redemption. So I think that's very, very relevant on the whole issue of Ikshud Mashiach. And by the way, I can't say I'm not totally sure of this, but I believe that the Tefillah L'Shlom HaMedina, which was commissioned by Rav Herzog, the first Rav Rashi of the Medina, was actually authored by Shai Agnon. So Agnon, of course, eventually won the Nobel Prize, so Agnon certainly was a literary man. And I would suggest, maybe as a little chiddush, that the fact that Agnon used the phrase Reishit Tzmichat Geulateinu, instead of saying Reishit Geulateinu, because after all, Aschalta de Geula, the most literal translation would have been Techilat HaGeula or Reishit HaGeula. Why did he stick in that extra word, Tzmichat? So Agnon, as I say, was a writer of subtlety. And I would suggest that he was comparing it to the cultivation of a plant. If you're a gardener, you plant something. So potentially it can flower and flourish into a wonderful thing. But it's not automatic. It all depends on the nutrients, the sunlight, the work, the weeding. So, Medinat Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, is not an automatic hatchala which creates a process that can't stop. It is a potential, like it's smicha, and if we don't respond to it in a proper way, it can turn into a dead end. So it's a bit of a sobering thought, meaning people tend to be binary. Is Hakamat HaMedina Atchalta de Gula, or is it simply an accommodation that God gave us, or the Churikarta would take even the opposite view? But the short answer is it's not a yes or no, meaning to say it is potentially an Atchalta de Geula, depending on how we respond with Avat Yisrael, with connecting to each other. Otherwise, it just turns into a dead end. It may not go anywhere. And in fact, part of what happens with Gush Katif and all of that is Hashem is showing us, again, it should never happen, but Hashem is showing us that the concept that Eretz Yisrael will always belong to the Jewish people, that's not in dispute, but the idea that we are guaranteed a state, even before Mashiach comes, once we're here, we're guaranteed, is not necessarily true. Hashem shows us things can be taken away unless they're appreciated, unless they are nurtured. And Hashem is showing that, Baruch Hashem, in relatively little increments. But, big things, unfortunately, could happen in a negative way as well as a positive way. Right? So I think that is kind of the primary lesson of the Haftorah that we get here, both from Yechezkel and Yirmiyahu. And as I say, the two Haftorahs do overlap. I see here in the Chumash, my Chumash doesn't have the Teimoni Haftorahs, but whenever I take this Chumash, I see it, that the Teimonim have another prophecy about the downfall of Mitzrayim from Yeshayahu. So it turns out that all of the three big Nevi'im have common prophecies about the downfall of Mitzrayim, and of course that fits very well the Parshiot of Era and Bo. And once again, the primary sin that is identified is arrogance and hubris, the Paro declaring, the Paro of the Chumash and the Paro of later times, declaring that he is the God of the Nile, and Hashem basically shows that you are not, and you can be destroyed in an instant. Now, the basic idea of the Haftorah, therefore, is really an extension of the well-known thought that we see in Chumash Bereishis, that Masa Avos Siman Labanim, that what happened to our forefathers is a sign of what will happen to us. Right? That's why we say what happens to Avram, when Avram had great wealth when he left Mitzrayim, parallels that we left Mitzrayim with great wealth. When Yitzchak digs wells and the wells are filled up, famous Ramban, so Yitzchak dug 2 wells and they were filled up, and then he dug a 3rd well and that lasted, and the Ramban connects it because he says the first well was called Asek. Asek is quarrelsomeness. and that refers to rejecting God, quarreling with God, and that refers to the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, which is primarily for the sin of idolatry. And the second well that was filled up was called Sitna, which is hatred, and that corresponds to the second Mikdash that was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam. And the third well was called Rechovot, right, same as the city, expansiveness, and that was not filled up, and that is based on the idea that the third Beis HaMikdash is never going to be destroyed. So that's Masa Avot Siman Labanim. But the same way we say it from the Chumash, we also see it in this way, that the Yetziat Mitzrayim and the downfall of Mitzrayim that the Jews experienced at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim will be replicated in later generations. So seen in this way, I want to then connect this to the Parsha, maybe a bit of a tenuous connection, that the Masa Avos Siman Labanim we see generally in the whole phenomenon of Yetziat Mitzrayim. And this point I've already made more than once, but we'll have some new applications. And that is the famous statements in the Haggadah, which is taken from the Mishnah in Arvei Pesachim, that Chayav Adam Lirais Asatzmo, each person must regard himself Ki'ilu Hu Yatzam in Mitzrayim, as if they were taken out of Mitzrayim, meaning it is not enough to remember what Hashem did for our ancestors. I am halachically obligated, at least on Leil Pesach, I am halachically obligated to personally feel that Hashem has taken me out of Egypt. Because that's what the Pasuk says, Bavor Zeh, because of what Hashem did, Asa Hashem Li, because of what God did for me, B'tseisi Mitzrayim, when I was taken out of Mitzrayim. And therefore it is not just commemoration, it is actually experiencing the Exodus. And the question becomes, what does that mean, right? I was not there. What does it mean I am obligated to feel as if I was taken out of Mitzrayim? So I mentioned, again, I'm just going to quickly review it and then give you something new, that there are two explanations. One is from the Rambam, and one is from the Baal HaTanya. The Rambam says it is a form of use of imagination, meaning the Rambam says we have to be grateful that God gave our forefathers freedom, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. But the point is, this is so distant, it happened so long ago, that it's very difficult for me to feel grateful to God for what God did 3,000 years ago. So how do I overcome that problem? So the Rambam says, you do so by make-believe, meaning to say, imagine what it is like, or what it would be like to be a slave. Imagine the beatings. Imagine the torture. Imagine the babies being thrown into the Nile. Imagine the lack of dignity, the lack of privacy, the living conditions. And then look at what Hashem has given you. And then you feel grateful. So according to the Rambam, it doesn't mean I was in Mitzrayim. I wasn't. But I got to make believe. It's like method acting, right? If you're familiar with Lee Strasberg method acting, put yourself in the situation. In fact, if that sounds trivial, the truth of the matter is, of Chaskel Levenstein, the great Mashgiach Panovich, once said that one of the requirements for being a good Baal Musar, one who can give tochacha, is you have to have a powerful imagination. You have to feel these stories. You have to feel Kriyas Yamsuf. You have to feel Yetzias Mitzrayim. So Hashem gave us imagination so we can vicariously experience things that we did not directly experience. So this is what the Rambam says. But the Baal HaTanya offers an alternative explanation, in which he says Mitzrayim has an alternative meaning. Mitzrayim means Egypt, but Mitzrayim also means limitations, constrictions, blockages, as we find in David HaMelech, Min ha-meitzar karatika, I call out to God from the narrow, confining elements. And he says the following, every single person, no matter how free you think you are, every single person has a Mitzrayim. The Mitzrayim is within me. My Mitzrayim, something that blocks me from realizing my potential. and from connecting to Hashem. It may be my arrogance, my gaiva. It may be my laziness, it may be my hedonism, my materialism. It may be my depression and lack of self-esteem. There may be a whole bunch of things. It may be my timidity, and it may be my pushiness. Whatever it is, these are attributes that are blocking me. They're paralyzing me. They're stopping me from moving forward and achieving my spiritual goals in life. In fact, not only stops you from all goals in life, but we're talking about the ruchnius here. Now, therefore, every single person has a Mitzrayim, and every single person needs a Yitzias Mitzrayim. And when Hashem took the Jews out of slavery, Hashem put a koach into the world that enables every single person to hitch on, to latch on to the koach of Yitzias Mitzrayim and achieve liberation of the Mitzrayim that enslaves us. You know, in the 60s and 70s, there were a lot of, they probably still do it, there were a lot of alternative Haggadahs being put out by, mainly non-Orthodox people. The civil rights Haggadah, the gay rights Haggadah, whatever it be. All sorts of Haggadahs that use the Exodus story to push whatever agenda they wanted to push. Now, on one hand, obviously, you're tampering with the halacha. You're not following what we're supposed to talk about, Leil Pesach. So, it's wrong. On the other hand, it is not a totally frivolous enterprise, because the truth of the matter is, Yitzias Mitzrayim is both an event and a pivotal event, a critical event in the formation of Am Yisrael, for which every parent must lovingly tell their child every single year. And that is the history of our people and God's providence over our people. But there's also a private idiosyncratic aspect, and that is, I have my slavery, and Yitzias Mitzrayim is my liberator as well. And the Baal Tanya says, the statement, each person must regard themselves as if they were taken out of Mitzrayim, should not be translated. Each person should regard themselves as if they left Egypt, because that's not a true statement. But that each person can leave that which blocks them, that which constricts them. David HaMelech says, Min ha-meitzar karati ka, I call out to God from the narrow, confining places. Meitzar, same word as Mitzrayim. And this is a great insight. We know that in sacred time generally, sacred time is not commemorative. It is re-experienced, meaning to say there are certain spiritual powers that come into the world at certain times, and those very powers come back again. You're not just commemorating something. Every Shavuot, there is a Matan Torah. We can't fully explain this. Every Sukkot, there is the Ananei HaKavod. Every Pesach, there is Yitzias Mitzrayim. But when we read these Parshios, the Shelah and other Svarim tell us, we do experience, even though it's not Pesach yet, we do experience Yitzias Mitzrayim in microcosm, because these are the Parshios of Yitzias Mitzrayim. So seen in this way, I want to share a thought with you that Parsha Bo, of course, in addition to narrative, is a very, very important halachic parsha, right? There are many, many mitzvos in Parsha Bo that are connected to Yitzias Mitzrayim very directly, Pesach, Matzah, Maror, and then indirectly, such as wearing tefillin, which is the source in this parsha, and redeeming the firstborn, Pidyon Haben, and the like. So this is a halachically very, very significant parsha. And we know that in particular, the three commandments that the Jews were given in connection with the Pesach Seder was eating the Korban Pesach, shechting and eating the Korban Pesach, eating Matzah, and eating Maror. And we read in the Haggadah, and this is, of course, taken from the Mishnah. So really, it's a Mishnah. Rabbi Gamliel Ohaya Omer, Rabbi Gamliel used to say, Call me shalai amar shalaisha devar malala b'Pesach. Anybody that doesn't explain 3 things during Pesach, during the Seder, lo yatsa yidei chavasa, has not fulfilled his mitzvah. And those 3 things are the Korban Pesach, the Matzah, and the Mara. Now, let's focus on this for a moment. Anyone that doesn't explain these 3 things does not fulfill their mitzvah. What mitzvah do they not fulfill? Right, so all the Rishonim say, they do fulfill matzah. In other words, you fulfill the mitzvah of matzah by eating it, even without explaining it. So you do fulfill Pesach, matzah, and maror. You don't fulfill the mitzvah of Haggadah. Haggadah is a Torah requirement, and not the Nusach. The Nusach is not Torah, but the Torah says, V'gada to levincha, so that has to include Pesach, matzah, and maror. Now, that's why, by the way, it's an interesting thing. Rabbi Gamliel's statement is positioned right before the second cup and right before people wash. So the meal is coming up soon. So what often happens is the women or the men, depending on whoever's getting the food, I don't want to say it has to be the woman who gets the food, but whoever is going into the kitchen will often go into the kitchen precisely when the Rabbi Gamliel paragraph is being read. And the problem is, if they skip that paragraph, they are not yotzei the mitzvah of Haggadah. That's the most important paragraph that must be recited in the Haggadah. So, if a woman or a man, whoever is going to get up and prepare the food during that juncture, they have to be very sure that they either read it before they get up, they go ahead, or at least they come back and they read it before washing, before the second cup and the like. And because of this too, because the issue is not just recitation, but it's understanding, so one must read it in whatever language they understand it. So if one doesn't know Hebrew and one is an English reader, then it actually should be read in English, because that is in other words, if you only had a time to recite only one paragraph in the Haggadah, that would be the paragraph you would have to recite. But the question is, why is that so significant? Why is it so important to discuss Pesach, Matzah, Maror? So here, the idea I want to share with you is that if you understand that Yetziat Mitzrayim is a double process, it is not only the historical event of the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, but the capacity that Hashem gives me to be liberated from my own Mitzrayim. This would suggest Pesach, Matzah, and Maror itself have double meanings. They are both connected to the Exodus, and they are connected to the Exodus of my own Mitzrayim. How is that so? So let me go in reverse order. I'll explain why. Let me start with the Maror first. The Mitzvah of Maror is that we are obligated, Pesach night, to eat bitter herbs, even though it doesn't have to be that bitter. Romaine lettuce is not particularly bitter, but at least something that has a taste of bitterness, in order to remember slavery and affliction. So Maror is a symbol of slavery, affliction, bitterness. It is based, of course, on the fact that slavery itself was described as bitter, vayemararu es chayehem. So what would this mean regarding my own personal Mitzrayim? The lesson is a very important lesson. The very first step to becoming liberated from that which enslaves you is to acknowledge your enslavement. That if a person has something in their life they need to correct, I have an anger problem, I have a selfishness problem, I have an ego problem. Be honest. Don't lie to yourself. And Maror is a reminder that if I am enslaved to something, I should remember and identify what it is. Because the first step to a slave gaining his freedom is for the slave to acknowledge that he's a slave. Because until the slave admits to himself that he's a slave, then he has no motivation to make any movement at all. Now I remember when I moved to Silver Spring, Maryland, and I was teaching in Baltimore. So Baltimore is north, so those of you that know that part of the United States, you have to go on a major highway, 95 north. But the problem is there's a turnoff to 95 south. If you're not careful, if you let your mind wander, you could find yourself going south. So one day I was not thinking, and all of a sudden I notice as I'm driving the Washington Monument, the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, which you don't see on the way to Baltimore. You only see it on the way to Virginia. So I had this sinking feeling in my stomach. I'm totally, on the wrong road. But I was resistant to admit it. I didn't want to admit it because I really didn't know how to get back on to 95 North. I didn't know the roads then. So my mind started, I can't even explain this logically, but my mind started coming up with explanations. Maybe you never noticed the Washington Monument on the way to Baltimore. And maybe it's there. Yes, you didn't notice it, So maybe you're on the right road. And then I thought, maybe if I just keep on going, it'll correct itself. Well, it does when you hit Florida. You can just do a little U-turn, but that would have been a long time. But what was the point? The point was, I didn't want to acknowledge I was lost because somehow it would have been too complicated to fix it. So what do? I just keep on staying on the same road, which is just getting me further and further and further from where I need to go. But that's kind of a metaphor for life. People just, it's like people often throw bad money after bad money, right? The concept is just keep on going. But of course, as Einstein famously said, what insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting to get a different result. That's insanity. And yet, that's what we do. So Maror is the reminder that if you want to be liberated from your Mitzrayim, you got to be honest enough to admit to yourself that you have a Mitzrayim. Because if you don't admit, you sweep things under the rug. Eventually, your rug gets 8 feet high. With all of the stuff that you swept under the rug. And at some point, you got to bite the bullet. And that's a very hard process. But you got to bite the bullet and acknowledge. And ultimately, that's very liberating. Acknowledging my servitudes is a very liberating event in a person's life. But Maror is not enough, because what happens is the relationship of Maror to Matzah is similar to the relationship of psychoanalysis to behavioral therapy. What do I mean by that? There are people who go for therapy, go for analysis, and they understand every trauma, every pressure, every breaking point, every single thing they've been subjected to in their entire life, including birth traumas and pre-birth traumas and maybe preconception traumas, everything that happens. And they can do this for 50 years, 60 years, they can do it their whole life. But at some point, a person has to use this information as a catalyst for action. And that's what matzah represents. It's a well-known idea. Everyone has heard this. That Chromates is puffed up. So Chromates represents arrogance and pride. And matzah, which is flat, represents simplicity and modesty. Although I have to tell you, with the kosher Pesach rolls that some caterers make, it's hard to tell the difference these days. But whatever it is, in theory, matzah is humility, and Chromates is arrogance. But the Maral gives another point. The Maral gives a different point, although it's not a contradiction. The Maral says Chromates represents inertia. Why is that so? Because if water goes onto flour, and you do nothing at all, it will automatically become Chromates. You don't need yeast. You don't need a starter. If water remains on unbaked flour for 18 minutes or more, it halachically is Chromates. The fermentation that occurred is sufficient to call it Chromates. So Chromates happens by itself once the water is there. Matzah is the affirmative action that is needed to arrest the process. And therefore the Maral says, Chromates represents the inertia of doing nothing. Matzah represents the imperative of seizing the moment and getting it done. And the Maral points out This is a very important point, because insight, Mara represents the insight into my condition. Insight is a wonderful thing. But if the insight doesn't lead to constructive action, then it's just a matter of mental gymnastics. It may give you a good feeling, but it doesn't make you a better person. It doesn't bring you closer to Hashem. You know, inspiration comes and goes. All of us have moments of spiritual inspiration at different times. It may be after Yom Kippur, after a Pesach Seder. It may be looking at our children or grandchildren. No, there are moments of genuine beauty and feeling. Maybe walking in Yerushalayim, looking at a sunset, like many, many things. But if you don't concretize the inspiration in something good, even if it's very small, inspiration just passes. You know, there was a famous academic, Robert Hutchins, became president of the University of Chicago at the age of 25. There were many graduate students who were older than him. And somebody once commented that he wasn't taking care of himself physically. So they said, no, but Dr. Hutchins, don't you ever feel the urge to exercise? And he said, I surely do, but I know if I lie down, it'll pass in a few moments. So I don't let it bother me. It'll go away. And in Ruchnius, in spirituality, it's very much the same idea. You got to concretize. So Maror is cognitive awareness and honesty. Matzah is commitment to action, even if it's small. Now, you may ask me a kasha. Well, wait a second here. So according to that symbolic commentary, we ought to eat maror before we eat matzah, because the maror tells me what my problems are. And the matzah reminds me of my power to change them in a good way. And yet, in the Seder, we first eat matzah, then we eat maror, then we eat matzah at the end. So here's the idea. It is true that sequentially, you got to know your problems before you can address them. But psychologically, dwelling on your problems first might be dangerous, because you may get so depressed and so admired that you may become paralyzed. So essentially, you need the awareness of your capacity to change, which is matzah, before you then dwell on your problem. And after you dwell on your problem, you then eat the matzah that says, now I'm able to do it. Meaning, you first have to have a commitment and an awareness of your capacity for positive growth before you identify the negatives that you need to work on. Because if one starts with the negatives, that can often destroy them. Because, in fact, the whole process of Chuva works the same way. You have to start Chuva with an awareness of the fundamental goodness that you have, as opposed to the fundamental evil. No person has ever changed for the better until they recognize that they already have goodness within them. Because if somebody believes they are totally bad, then where are they going to get the psychic strength and motivation to believe that change is even possible? Right? So that's why in Musar, true Musar builds up a person. It doesn't tell a person how lowly they are. Okay, so that's Maror and that's Matzah. What is Pesach? So Pesach, of course, represents many things. Pesach was the god of Egypt, etc. It represents the destruction of Avodah Zarah, the commitment to God. But one of the interesting halachos of the Korban Pesach is that the Korban Pesach can only be brought in a group. You cannot bring a Korban Pesach alone. Even if you have a very big appetite, and the lamb is a little tiny lamb, 8 days old, because you can bring a very young lamb for a Korban Pesach, and you could finish the whole thing. Can't do it. Ein shochten es ha-Pesach al hayachid. The Korban Pesach requires that I join with somebody else. If it's with my family, it's with my family. If it's not my family, I join a family. Or I join other people who don't have a family, and we create our family, at least for that night. Why is that so important? So Pirkei Avos tells us, Aseh lecha rav, make for yourself a teacher, ukanei lecha chaver, and acquire, buy yourself a friend. Interesting lashon. Buy yourself. Why do I have to buy myself a friend? Am I supposed to pay for friendship? The answer is yeah, friendship has a cost. But the cost is not money. But the cost of getting yourself a friend is being willing to be a friend. Right? I would like a friend that when I have problems, when I have difficulties, I want somebody to be there for me. Wonderful thing. Very important thing. But there's a cost. You have to be willing to be there for them. You cannot expect, unless, you're best friends with the Chafetz Chaim or something, but you cannot expect reasonably a person to be there for you, b'leiv v'nefesh. Whenever they have a problem, you don't have time for them. So the Mishnah is very meduyak. Kenei l'cha chaver. You got to buy a friend, not with money, but with the emotional investments of caring about another person. Now, why is friendship so important? So the Rambam gives 3 reasons why friendship is important. And I'm going to use modern terms for it. Reason number 1, we will call utilitarian. And that is, a friend is like a life insurance policy. Sometimes I really need somebody. I mean, I lost my keys. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere. If I don't have a friend, who do I call when I'm in trouble? So therefore, you need a friend. It's like life insurance. You hope you're not going to need it, etc. But it's good to have if it's needed.
For the wife.
Yeah, for the wife, whatever it would be. So as a result, a friend can certainly be a spouse. That can be, but once again, utilitarianism is I cultivate friends in case I really need them when it happens. The second reason for friendship, the Rambam says, is social. We are, as Aristotle remarked, and the Rambam actually quotes Aristotle, we are social beings by inclination. We like to be able to interact with people. Again, different levels. There are introverts, there are extroverts, but even introverts, right? Introverts don't like crowds, but, usually they still, want to be connected to somebody. That's kind of a human need to be connected on some level. But the Rambam says those things are important, but they are not the ultimate goal and purpose of friendship. The ultimate goal and purpose of friendship is that we help each other become a better person than we would otherwise be. It's what you would call spiritual fellowship or spiritual connection, in which each person helps the other grow in their godliness, in their holiness, in their goodness. Now, those types of friendships, and of course, in the best type of marriage, that's exactly what a marriage would be. That's why marriage is called Re'im Ahuvim, beloved friends. And that's an important thing, because you might think, friends? Isn't that demeaning it? Isn't marriage about romance and passion? What is the concept? Why are you calling it friend? The answer is, friend is a much higher and important term than you would assume. Because friend means I'm there to help the other become the best person they can become. And they're there to help me become the best person that I could be. Now, that type of friendship is sometimes a difficult and challenging friendship. If I have a friend with whom I just, go out for a cup of coffee once, so if they do things that aren't so great, well, I don't, I'm not necessarily going to get involved. But a friendship in which each one is committed to the other sometimes means we bring up difficult issues and uncomfortable issues, but of course we also have to be willing to have them brought up vis-a-vis ourselves as well. So, how is that connected to Pesach, Matzah, and Maror? So, if Maror is the honesty to identify my own Mitzrayim, and Matzah is the commitment to take action and not be a product of inertia, Pesach is a reminder that that journey cannot be taken alone. We need to find people in our lives which will give us the strength and the inspiration that when we falter and when we are weak, we have someone that will help us get back on our feet. And when they falter and they are weak, we will try to be the person that helps them get back on their feet. Shlomo HaMelech's statement Tovim hashnayim min ha'echad in Koheles. Two are better than one. For if one falls, who will pick him up? But when you have two people, if one falls, the other is there. And this applies in its highest sense in marriage, but it's not only in marriage. Meaning a person might say, well, I'm single, I don't have a shidduch, where does that leave me? Okay, again, B'ezras Hashem, everybody should get married in a good way. But even before marriage, you find in your life people that you can help, and you can inspire, and people that help and inspire you. And in that way, you are able to have Yetzias Mitzrayim, because we cannot really do it alone. We need the support of others, and we need to be supporters of others. So although everybody's Mitzrayim is unique, in a sense, my Yetzias Mitzrayim is a solitary journey. Because the Mitzrayim that I'm grappling with is not the same Mitzrayim that somebody else is grappling with. So everybody is going through their own journey, but we go through our own separate journeys together. And that's the only way we'll be able to manage it. So in a sense, therefore, my perhaps tenuous linkage to the Haftorah is that just as the Haftorah reminds us that the Exodus of Egypt will reverberate in later times with the downfall of Mitzrayim under the principle Matzah, Avodah, Siman Labanim, so too, with respect to our personal Exodus, the Exodus of Egypt reverberates and repeats itself over and over and over again in terms of the Yetzias Mitzrayim from our own limitations. So B'ezras Hashem, I hope HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give us the insight to identify our Mitzrayims, the koach to do something about it, which is the matzah, and to find the people in life that we can take that journey with. So we'll take care. Good Chodesh.
Good.